So in the second voiceover PowerPoint, which is the shortest of the three, we're just going to focus a little bit on how muscles get the energy that they need in order to contract. So in the cycle of muscle contraction, that sliding filament model you saw on the previous PowerPoint, you saw the places where ATP is needed, and we talked about how the myosin heads need the ATP in order to form the cross bridges and then move away from the actin so that another contraction cycle can begin. And so muscle cells do need a lot of ATP. Now, remember that we've talked about how most cells do get their ATP from the process of cellular respiration, and that process happens. Well, remember that there's three parts of cellular respiration: glycolysis, the TCA or Krebs cycle, and then the electron transport chain. Now that first part, glycolysis, happens in the cytoplasm of a cell, but the second two parts, the TCA cycle and then the electron transport chain, those parts happen in the mitochondria, and those parts, assuming, only happen if we have oxygen, right? And those parts are, assuming we have oxygen, are producing the most ATP. Remember, if we just go through glycolysis and then the cell realizes it doesn't have enough oxygen to go through the TCA and the electron transport chain, it will go ahead and actually produce lactic acid in a process called anaerobic respiration, but that process only produces 2 ATP. Whereas if we go through all of cellular respiration, remember that we can produce up to 38 molecules of ATP. So I just want you to keep all of that in mind. So again, that's part of why muscle cells have so many mitochondria. But there's another molecule other than ATP that actually helps the muscle cell to keep up its stores of ATP. So that molecule is actually creatine phosphate. So creatine phosphate is a molecule that helps to replenish stores of ATP. Remember that when we break down ATP, it becomes ADP. And in order to turn the ADP back to ATP, we just need to add on a phosphate molecule or recreate that bond with that third phosphate. And so you can imagine that just from the name creatine phosphate, what the creatine phosphate is probably doing is donating a phosphate so that ATP can turn back to ATP. And that's exactly what it does. So aerobic metabolism provides the most of the ATP needed for contraction, and that's just cellular respiration like we talked about. But at peak activity, that cellular respiration is not, we're not going to have enough oxygen. If you think about when you run a sprint or when if you ran a marathon, any kind of activity where you're sort of depleting your body's stores of ATP. So if you do any kind of, often we think about a sprint because of the intensity for a short period of time, your body's not able to get enough oxygen. Some of the cells will have enough oxygen and will continue doing cellular respiration, but some of the cells won't have enough oxygen and will have to do anaerobic respiration, right? So that's just this little bullet point here is just reminding you of that. At peak activity, anaerobic glycolysis is needed to generate ATP. And what does anaerobic glycolysis produce? Well, it produces lactic acid. And lactic acid is what, makes your muscles sore and eventually might make your muscles cramp up if you're doing very strenuous exercise. You can almost even taste the lactic acid if you ran a sprint and you have that funny taste in your mouth. That's partly the lactic acid. So energy production and use patterns mirror muscle activity. fatigued muscles no longer contract. So what this is sort of saying is that ATP is needed for muscle contraction. And as your body starts to get tired or fatigued or run out of oxygen, it will do anaerobic glycolysis, which will help produce some ATP. But remember, the difference between anaerobic glycolysis or anaerobic respiration and aerobic respiration: anaerobic respiration produces 2 molecules of ATP, aerobic respiration produces 36 to 38. So it's not going to produce enough ATP in the long run. And at some point, your muscles will essentially stop being able to contract. Again, that manifests in your body as fatigue. You feel tired and your muscles sort of stop working as well as they were. But, if you were, again, running a marathon and you just tried to keep running through the fatigue, at some point, obviously that's why people train for marathons, but at some point your body would just give out. Your muscles would stop working. And, sometimes you see that when you watch a race, that some people actually just collapse. And that's because, their body is just not making enough ATP for their muscles to work correctly. So there's a buildup of lactic acid and an exhaustion of energy resources. So we've sort of talked about that. But a key term you need to know is oxygen debt. So after you've exercised strenuously and you've started producing lactic acid because you don't have enough oxygen, even when you stop exercising, you're gonna still be tired for a bit. After you run a sprint or after you run a marathon, you're most likely going to want to sit down for a bit. And that's partly because it's not as if once you stop exercising, everything is copacetic in your body again. You're actually in a state of oxygen debt. You've taken out more energy reserves than your body had, and so it will take your body a certain amount of time to, get enough oxygen again so that all your cells are back to using aerobic respiration. Again, remembering that aerobic respiration is preferable to anaerobic respiration because it can produce a lot more ATP. So again, after your strenuous exercise, your body needs to have a period of no exercise, and depending on the person, that period of time will be different, but the point just is that you're in a state of oxygen debt. Your body needs some time to replenish its stores. So here it's saying that oxygen debt is the amount of oxygen required during the resting period to restore the muscle to normal conditions. So here is a figure just breaking down that creatine phosphate, helping us to understand how that creatine phosphate helps to replenish ATP stores. And actually, I think the next slide is a little bit more helpful for looking at that. But this is because this slide is showing us when our cellular ATP is high. So in other words, when our stores are good, what will happen is that the creatine will turn back into creatine phosphate. The phosphates will get added to the creatine so that we have those stores for when we need them. And when we need them is actually, again, in the middle of exercise when cellular ATP is low. So if you're exercising for long periods of time, your muscles continue to need ATP, and if the cellular respiration isn't able to keep up with the demand, then creatine phosphate stores will help to replenish the ATP. And the way it does that is the creatine phosphate breaks off its P and gives the P to ADP, so that ADP turns into ATP. And again, when we're not exercising, then the body will do that reverse process that we just saw in the previous slide to restore the creatine phosphate stores so that we have this creatine phosphate when we need it. So this is just a diagram reminding you of the process of cellular respiration and the difference between anaerobic and aerobic respiration. So again, remember that the three parts of cellular respiration are glycolysis, the TCA or Krebs cycle, or here it's called the citric acid cycle, and then the electron transport chain. So if the cell that is doing the cellular respiration does not have enough oxygen, then it will do anaerobic respiration. And the anaerobic respiration, glycolysis on its own produces 2 ATP, but then the anaerobic respiration will not allow the citric acid cycle and the electron transport chain to happen, and so the end result will be lactic acid. If the cell does have enough oxygen to go through all three parts of cellular respiration, then we will make a lot more ATP, 34, and here it's saying 34, but again, it can be up to 38 molecules of ATP. So as it says in this diagram, number 1 says oxygen carried from the lungs by hemoglobin in red blood cells is temporarily stored in muscle cells by myoglobin, increasing the amount of oxygen available to support aerobic respiration. So myoglobin is what holds oxygen in muscle cells, and it's actually what gives muscles their reddish color. So muscle appears red just like blood appears red because of these hemoglobin and myoglobin molecules. But the myoglobin is holding the oxygen, again, so because muscle cells do require all this ATP, therefore they're going to have to do a lot of cellular respiration, therefore they're going to need oxygen. So the body stores oxygen in the myoglobin in muscle cells so that the oxygen is readily available. But, as number 2 says, in the absence of sufficient oxygen, aerobic respiration cannot continue, and glycolysis leads to lactic acid formation. So I think this table does help further explain what we've been talking about. So if you look up at type of exercise, that first column says if we're doing low to moderate intensity exercise, so like if we're walking, our blood flow provides sufficient oxygen for cellular requirements. So therefore, we can do aerobic respiration and produce 36 to 38 molecules of ATP. And when the byproduct, the end result of cellular respiration is carbon dioxide, so we will breathe out carbon dioxide. If, on the other hand, if you look at that second column, if we're doing high intensity exercise, such as a sprint, or we're climbing a high peak, or we're running a marathon, eventually our oxygen supply will not be sufficient for cellular requirements, and some of our cells will end up doing anaerobic respiration. And anaerobic respiration means that the cell will go through glycolysis, but it will not continue on, and it will just stop after glycolysis. So it will only produce 2 ATP per glucose molecule, and the end result will be lactic acid. And, what, again, we sort of talked about it over time. If you continue with that high intensity exercise, those 2 ATP per glucose molecule will help you to keep going to some extent, but at some point, even that won't be enough, and then, your muscles may start to cramp up. Okay, so there's a couple of other ideas about muscle contraction that we need to understand. So muscle contraction has this all or none principle. So if we're talking about, essentially what happens is if a muscle cell contracts, it's going to produce a certain amount of tension, and that's going to be always the same amount of tension. Okay, so it's not for one particular muscle cell. It's not like it can produce a little tension or a lot of tension. It will, if it contracts, it will always produce the same amount of tension. So the question then is how do our muscles sort of what's the difference between a contraction when we want to pick up a feather and a contraction when we want to pick up a 50-pound barbell? Well, the difference is that we're using more muscle cells. Each muscle cell is going to produce a certain amount of tension, a constant amount of tension. But the way we can get more tension is by using more muscle cells and adding up those amounts of tension. So I hope that sort of makes sense. That can be a little bit confusing. What we call when we have one muscle cell producing that stable amount of tension, that constant amount of tension, that's called a twitch. So you can almost think about it like, sometimes you'll sort of see a little tiny twitch maybe on your arm, or your eyelid will twitch, and that's more than one muscle cell twitching. But you can think about that as being that's a tiny little muscle twitch, right? So that's like a twitch. Now, if you wanted to turn that twitch into the ability to lift a 50-pound barbell, you would obviously need to use more muscle cells. And if you were to use more muscle cells, then each muscle cell's twitch would get added together, and the force that they're able to exert would be stronger. But you do need to understand that for each muscle cell has an all or none principle, meaning either it's going to contract or it's not going to contract. And if it's going to contract, it's always going to produce the same amount of force. So the other thing, we're going to see a picture of this in the next slide, but a motor unit, the definition of a motor unit is all the muscle fibers innervated by one neuron. So each motor neuron is able to make contact with several muscle fibers. And so again, if we wanted to produce a small amount of muscle contraction, maybe the motor neuron would only signal to a couple of its muscle fibers. Or if we wanted to produce a larger contraction, then the motor neuron would tell all of its muscle fibers to fire. So we've talked about muscle tone as being the ability to stabilize bones and joints. And again, muscle tone is just how many muscle fibers are contracting at any given one time. If you're just sort of in a relaxed state, there's going to be some muscle fibers contracting to help hold you in that position. But if you wanted to, lift up a baby, then suddenly a lot more muscle fibers are going to go ahead and contract. So recruitment is an increase in the number of motor units being activated during contraction. So again, if we want to do some kind of work, either lifting a weight or lifting a shopping bag or, anything that requires force, we need to recruit more muscle fibers, okay? So if we're picking up a feather, maybe we use a few muscle fibers. If we're picking up a barbell, we have to recruit more muscle fibers so that we have enough force to do the job. So here is a picture of that motor unit. You can see that the picture is labeling motor neuron of motor unit 1 and motor neuron of motor unit 2. So motor unit 1, if you follow it down to the axon terminals, you can see that motor unit 1 is touching all of the purple muscle fibers, whereas motor unit 2 is touching all of the pink muscle fibers. So once again, if we had to pick up a feather, maybe our body would just send the signal down motor unit 1, and we would just use those purple fibers. But then if we had to pick up something heavier, like a shopping bag, then our body would send the signal down motor unit 1 and motor unit 2, so that we're getting twice as many muscle fibers involved. We are recruiting twice as many muscle fibers. So when a muscle contracts, there's some more terms that we need to become familiar with. Isometric meaning that the length of the muscle remains constant. So if you think about a muscle that when it contracts, the length remains fairly constant. So, for example, some of the muscles, or the masseter muscle, which we'll see in the next PowerPoint, is one where the length is going to remain constant though the tension rises, versus an isotonic muscle where the tension is still rising in the muscle but the length of the muscle changes. And most of our muscles that are involved in movement, such as walking or running, are isotonic muscles. So, our biceps muscle, our soleus muscle, or gastrocnemius muscle, all those muscles, they do shorten when they contract. There's also two different types of muscle fibers: slow twitch muscle fibers and fast twitch muscle fibers. And again, if we think about that twitch, the fast twitch will twitch faster, but it will tire more quickly, whereas slow twitch muscle fibers will, their contraction is slightly slower, but they have a greater endurance. So the average person has about half slow twitch and half fast twitch muscle fibers. But high performance athletes will not have half and half. So in other words, an Olympic sprinter will have predominantly fast twitch muscle fibers, whereas an Olympic marathoner or distance swimmer, someone who does more endurance kind of sports, will have predominantly slow twitch muscle fibers. Okay, so this graph shows us some more terms and concepts that we need to become familiar with. So recall that when a muscle cell contracts, it contracts because it gets a signal from a motor neuron. So the motor neuron will get the signal, pass it down its axon to its axon terminal, which will cause the synaptic vesicles to release the acetylcholine into the synaptic cleft, and the acetylcholine will bind to receptors on the sarcolemma, which will cause the action potential to travel down the sarcolemma, down the T tubules, which will cause the calcium to release from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So the point is that there are many, many steps between when the motor neuron gets a signal for the muscle to contract and when the muscle actually contracts. And so that there is actually a sort of a delay, and that delay is called the latent period. So in this graph you can see the time of stimulation, and then there's a period where all those steps have to happen before the muscle actually contracts, and that is called the latent period. And another thing to keep in mind is something called the threshold stimulus. So because there are so many steps to a muscle contracting, it doesn't want to contract. Essentially, the body doesn't want to do all those steps if it doesn't have to. So sometimes nerves will get messages that they're not going to necessarily act on. And so there is this threshold stimulus, this amount of message that the body has to get to actually go through contraction. But once the message reaches that threshold stimulus, then it is going to contract. So the threshold stimulus is just the minimum amount of stimulus required to generate an impulse through the muscle. So now we're going to just look at some basic principles of muscle contraction. So we talked about how muscles have this all or none principle. And so that's what this graph is showing. It's showing that when a muscle contracts, when it twitches, I should say, it's always going to have the same force of contraction because of that all or none principle. So each of those little arrows at the bottom is showing a stimulus. So the muscle will get a stimulus, it will contract, and then it will relax. And then there will be a stimulus, and then it will contract, and it will relax. And again, if we want the force of contraction to be stronger, right now, this is demonstrating that for a given muscle or a given muscle cell, the force of contraction is always going to be the same. So what about if we need the force of contraction to be stronger? Well, then we need to recruit more muscle fibers, or what's called summation. So summation happens because more muscle fibers are recruited, but also because we are having stimuli more frequently. So if you notice, the first arrow at the bottom is some kind of stimulus that causes the muscle to contract. Now, if there is another stimulus before this muscle gets a chance to relax, then it will almost get added. The force of contractions will get added. And so, again, if you have a stimulus, another stimulus before the muscle has gotten a chance to relax, then the force of contraction will increase, and that is called summation. If we have so many stimuli that there reaches a point where we cannot have any more summation. So, and that point is called tetanus. So what this graph is showing you is that you can see at the bottom there's a bunch of stimuli happening together, and the summation is happening, but then there's a sort of a limit to the summation. So that's called tetanus. It's essentially the most your muscle can possibly contract. It's recruited all of its muscle fibers. And part of the reason that happens is because there's absolutely no opportunity for relaxation. So at the beginning of this graph, you can see that there's a stimulus and contraction, and then there's a bit of relaxation before the next stimulus, and then there's a stimulus and contraction and a bit of relaxation. But on the as we go farther along this graph, you can see that the muscle almost has no opportunity to relax, and that's when your muscles will really reach the point of tetanus. So here are these three graphs together, so you get the sense of what causes summation and then tetanus. And the amount, just to drive this point home, the amount of tension in a muscle is dependent upon the frequency at which the individual muscle fibers are stimulated and how many muscle fibers take part in the overall contraction of the muscle. So it depends on the frequency of stimulation and on the number of muscle fibers involved. So if we look at this arrow as we go from this first graph and then down to the third graph, the stimulation frequency is increasing. And then I would dare say that the number of muscle fibers being recruited is also increasing. Okay, so now we're just going to touch briefly upon smooth muscle and cardiac muscle before we finish up this PowerPoint. So with smooth muscle, there's two types of smooth muscle: multi-unit smooth muscle and visceral smooth muscle. So visceral smooth muscle is found mostly in hollow organs, whereas multi-unit smooth muscle is found in blood vessels and in the iris of the eye. So see where it says the visceral smooth muscle, these fibers stimulate one another, demonstrating rhythmicity. So in other words, the visceral smooth muscles are called visceral smooth muscles because they can contract together because they are able to stimulate one another, whereas the multi-unit smooth muscles are only able to contract in response to a stimulation. So they need that stimulation from a nerve in order to contract, whereas the visceral smooth muscles, some of them can get a message from a nerve and then they'll tell the other cells to contract. With regard to smooth muscle contraction, it's quite similar to skeletal muscle contraction because there's also the actin and the myosin, but instead of just having acetylcholine as a neurotransmitter, there's one other neurotransmitter, and it's called neuroepinephrine. And smooth muscle is slower to contract, but it can contract for longer. I also just want to remind you that smooth muscle does not have any striation. So even though it does have actin and myosin, its sarcoplasmic reticulum is not as well developed, and so the And so the striations aren't as apparent. Again, if we looked at those slides of the smooth muscle versus the skeletal muscle, you could see the striations with the skeletal muscle, but not with the smooth muscle. So with cardiac muscle cells are branched, which is different than smooth and skeletal muscles, but they do have striations. And again, their mechanism for contraction is similar to skeletal and smooth muscle, but there's a couple differences. So the transverse tubules of cardiac muscles have extra calcium so that cardiac muscles can contract for longer periods. You know, if you think about your heart is always pumping and we can't, there's never a period where your heart is not pumping. And so it needs more calcium stores than many of your other muscles. So the transverse tubules supply extra calcium in cardiac muscle cells. Cardiac muscle cells are also self-exciting and can have rhythmic contractions. So they're similar to the visceral smooth muscle in that way, that they can communicate with one another in order so that they all contract at the same time. And the way they communicate with one another is through intercalated discs. So that's how they pass the message between one another so that they can all contract together. So here's a table just breaking down these three types of muscle. Let's see. I think we've essentially touched on most of this, and you should be comfortable with all of this. The key point here that maybe we didn't drive home is that skeletal muscles are voluntary, whereas smooth and cardiac muscles are involuntary. Okay, so that's it for PowerPoint number 2, part 2, and in the part 3 we'll look at the muscles as a whole, the names and locations and functions of the muscles that we are going to learn about in our body.